For years, I believed I had vanished from my family's memory, like a ghost in my own home. But one evening, when a journalist spoke my name on live television, everything I thought I had lost came rushing back, and nothing in my life was ever the same again. My name is Arthur Bennett, though most people just call me Arthur. I have lived in Leeds for over 30 years now, in the same small brick house, on a quiet street, not far from Roundhay Park. If you were to walk past my home, you might think it's just another ordinary house. Nothing special, nothing remarkable, and in many ways, you would be right. But behind those walls, within those rooms, is a silence so thick it has often felt like another presence in the house, like a ghost that lingers, uninvited yet impossible to ignore. When I say silence, I don't mean the pleasant kind, the type you find when you're resting after a long day, or the peaceful hush of a countryside morning. No, the silence I speak of is sharp, heavy, and relentless. It isn't the absence of noise, it is the absence of voices that should be there, the absence of laughter, of greetings, of the little interruptions that family life brings. It is the silence of neglect, the silence of being forgotten. For years, I have lived inside that silence. My children, grown adults now, with families of their own, seemed to drift further and further away from me as the years passed. When they were younger, they would visit me, sometimes bring the grandchildren along, and the house would come alive with their energy. But slowly, those visits became less frequent. The excuses started small. Work was too busy, the children had school activities, or the drive from Birmingham was too long. Then came longer stretches without contact. Weeks turned into months, months into years. I would sit by the phone, staring at it like an old friend who had fallen out of touch, hoping it might ring. Most of the time, it didn't. Birthdays passed, quietly, mine, theirs, even the grandchildren's. I always remembered the dates. I would circle them on my calendar in the kitchen, a hopeful reminder that maybe, just maybe, someone would call. But the days slipped by in silence. Christmas was the worst. While the world outside filled with twinkling lights and bustling markets, my own living room sat dim and still. I tried decorating once or twice, putting up a small artificial tree by the fireplace. But after spending Christmas morning alone, with only the sound of the kettle boiling, it felt too painful. Eventually, I stopped bothering. I often wondered if it was something I had done. Did I fail as a father? Did I not show enough affection, or perhaps too much discipline? Memory is cruel in old age, replays the mistakes louder than the triumphs. I remembered the arguments with my eldest son, Peter, when he was in his 20s and desperate to leave home. I remembered the cold words exchanged with my daughter, Elaine, when she accused me of not being supportive enough of her choices. Did those moments fester into the silence I live with now? Or was it simply that life carried them away, swept them into their own busy orbits, where there was no space left for me? The truth is, I don't know. And not knowing is its own kind of torment. My days in Leeds have become predictable. I wake early, often before the sun has risen, because sleep does not come easily when loneliness weighs on the mind. I make myself a cup of tea, always Yorkshire tea, strong and dark, just as my late wife, Margaret, used to prefer it. I sit by the window, the same chair, every morning, and watch the world outside slowly stir to life. Neighbors walk their dogs, children hurry off to school, postmen deliver letters that are rarely addressed to me. The city is alive, vibrant even, but inside my house, there is only me and the silence. I fill the hours with small routines. A walk to the local shop on Street Lane, where the cashier greets me politely, but without recognition of who I am. Reading the newspaper at the kitchen table, circling stories that catch my interest, though I rarely have anyone to discuss them with. Sometimes, I venture into Roundhay Park, sit on a bench by the lake, and watch families pass by, parents pushing prams, grandparents laughing with children. I often imagine myself among them, as if I could slip into their lives for just a moment, borrow their warmth before returning to my solitude. The silence, however, follows me everywhere. It echoes in the empty spare room upstairs, where my grandchildren once slept during weekend visits. It lingers at the dinner table, where there is only one plate, now instead of 4 or 5. It hums quietly in the evenings, when I switch on the television, not because I care about the programs, but because the voices drown out the quiet for a little while. What hurts most is not just being forgotten, but feeling invisible, as though I cease to exist in the world of those who should care about me most. It is one thing to be alone. It is another to be erased. Yet, strangely enough, I have become skilled at wearing a mask when I do meet people. At the doctor's office, I smile politely and assure them I am managing fine on my own. At the local cafe, I exchange pleasantries with the barista, never revealing that this is the only human conversation I might have all day. Even to my neighbors, I present the image of a man content with his solitude, because admitting otherwise feels like exposing a wound too raw to be touched. There are moments when I almost convince myself that the silence is not so bad, that solitude brings freedom, that I can do as I please without compromise. But then, without fail, something pierces through an old photograph, a memory of a birthday party long ago, or simply the sound of a neighbor's grandchildren laughing in the garden, and the truth comes rushing back. I miss them. I miss being needed. I miss being loved. I sometimes think of my life as a book that has been set aside on a shelf, gathering dust, forgotten by its readers, and I wonder, will anyone ever pick it up again, or will it remain untouched until the end, my story untold? In Leeds, surrounded by the ordinary hum of city life, my home remains quiet, too quiet. It is a silence that has defined these later years of mine, a silence that whispers one cruel reminder again and again: you have been forgotten. And yet, somewhere deep inside, I keep a fragile hope alive, that one day the silence might be broken not by the television, not by the kettle, but by a familiar voice saying, "Hello, Dad, how are you?" Until then, I remain here, in Leeds, waiting. If Leeds has become the stage of my silence, then Manchester is the city that holds the echoes of laughter, warmth, and the kind of noise I now miss more than anything. Whenever I think back to the better days, my mind doesn't wander to holidays abroad or grand occasions, it drifts. Instead, to the Sunday dinners we used to share in Manchester. Those gatherings are stitched into the fabric of my memory, as vivid as if they happened only yesterday, even though decades have passed. Back then, life was far from easy, but it was full. Margaret and I lived in a modest semi-detached house near Didsbury. It wasn't large, certainly not fancy, but it was ours, and within its walls lived a kind of joy that money couldn't buy. The smell of Margaret's roast beef and Yorkshire puddings would drift through every room, drawing the children from wherever they were playing. Peter would always be the first to hover in the kitchen, sneaking a slice of carrot or potato from the roasting tray when he thought his mother wasn't looking. Elaine, my eldest daughter, was more refined, more cautious. She'd sit at the dining table with her schoolbooks, pretending to study while really waiting for the food. I remember the sound of the front door opening and closing as neighbors or friends popped by unannounced. In those days, no one needed to schedule visits weeks in advance. People just came over, and the kettle was always ready for another round of tea. The house would fill with voices, children running through the hallway, Margaret's firm but loving warnings not to spill gravy on the carpet, the low hum of conversation between adults catching up about work or the latest news in the community. Those meals were never just about food. They were about belonging. Around that table, everyone had a place. There was no silence then, only the kind of chaotic noise that now feels like music to me. I would carve the roast, pretending to be the stern head of the household, though I often slipped extra portions onto the children's plates when Margaret wasn't looking. She always caught me, of course, but she would only smile and shake her head, as though secretly approving. One memory that refuses to fade is of a particular Sunday in late autumn, perhaps around 1984. The leaves outside had turned shades of amber and gold, and the air carried that crisp chill Manchester is known for. That day, we had more people than usual. My brother Thomas had come up from Birmingham with his wife, and the house was buzzing with energy. Margaret cooked enough food to feed an army, and somehow, by the end of it, not a scrap was left. I can still see little Sophie, my youngest daughter, only about 6 at the time, running around with her cousin, their cheeks flushed from laughter. They had built a castle out of sofa cushions in the living room and declared it off-limits to all adults. The sound of their giggles was the purest joy I have ever known. Later that evening, when everyone had left and the house finally quieted down, Margaret and I sat together with cups of tea. She leaned against me, exhausted but content, and said, "This is what life is meant to be, Arthur, all of us, together." And she was right. Those days were the essence of family, small, ordinary moments that now shine like jewels in my memory. Manchester. wasn't just about the house or the meals. It was about community too. We knew our neighbors by name. Mrs. Wilson from next door often lent us sugar, and in return Margaret baked her scones. On summer evenings, the children played football in the street until the light faded, and no one worried about safety or strangers. I would sometimes join them, kicking the ball clumsily in my work shoes, much to the children's delight. The street felt alive, each family part of a larger whole. It is hard for me to reconcile that vibrant past with the present loneliness. How did we go from being a family that couldn't fit around a table without squeezing chairs together, to me, sitting alone in Leeds, with no visitors and no voices? Sometimes I wonder if nostalgia makes the past seem brighter than it really was. Were those days truly as golden as I remember, or have the years of silence polished them into something shinier than the truth? Yet every time I recall Margaret's laughter, the sparkle in her eyes when she watched the children play, I know those memories are real. They aren't illusions, they are pieces of a life once lived. And losing them, or rather losing the reality of them, is what makes the emptiness now so unbearable. When Margaret passed away far too early, taken by an illness we never fully understood, the dinners in Manchester stopped. I tried to keep them alive, to gather the children and recreate that sense of togetherness, but it was never the same. Without her, the glue that held us together dissolved. Slowly, the gatherings grew less frequent. The children began their own lives, moved to different cities, built their own families. And while I understood that life pulls people in different directions, I never expected it to pull them so far that they would forget to look back. Still, Manchester lives on in my mind as a place of warmth, of noise, of love. Sometimes, when I walk through the streets of Leeds, I catch a whiff of roast meat from someone's kitchen or hear the distant laughter of children playing, and it transports me back to those days. For a fleeting moment, I am in that small house. Again, carving the roast while Margaret scolds me gently, the children arguing over who gets the biggest Yorkshire pudding. The contrast between then and now is almost too much to bear. And yet, I hold on to those memories fiercely. They remind me that I was once surrounded by love, that I was once part of something larger than myself. They remind me that silence was not always my companion, that once, long ago, noise filled every corner of my life. Sometimes, late at night, I dream of Manchester. I dream of the house, of Margaret's voice calling us to the table, of the children's laughter bouncing off the walls. And when I wake, for just a moment, I believe I am still there. Then reality creeps back in the empty house in Leeds, the quiet that greets me in the morning, and I realize it was only a dream. But perhaps dreams are all I have left of those better days. Memories are strange that way they can hurt and heal at the same time. They remind me of what I've lost, but they also prove that I once had it. And maybe that's why I cling to them so tightly. Because, in remembering Manchester, I remember myself not just as the old man I am now, but as a father, a husband, a man surrounded by love and noise and life. Those were the better days. And though they are gone, they still live within me. In the corners of my mind where silence cannot reach, there is a peculiar heaviness that comes with old age, and it is not just in the bones or the joints. No, the heaviest weight is the kind you carry in your heart, a weight made of silence, of absence, of knowing that the world you once belonged to has moved on without you. If I had to put it into words, I'd say loneliness in old age is like being the last guest at a party after everyone else has gone home. The music has stopped, the laughter has faded, and you're left sitting in an empty room, wondering how long ago the joy slipped away. My daily life in Leeds is simple, predictable, some might even say monotonous. I wake early, long before the neighborhood stirs. Sleep has never been easy for me, especially since Margaret passed. The bed feels too large, the sheets too cold, and so I often rise before dawn, shuffling into the kitchen in my slippers to boil the kettle. A mug of strong Yorkshire tea in my hands, I sit in the armchair by the window and watch the world wake up. Across the street, I see Mrs. Harrington open her curtains at precisely 7:15 every morning. A postman cycles down the road, his bag swinging at his side. Children in school uniforms chatter as they walk past, their backpacks bouncing with every step. And there I sit, invisible. To them, I am just another old man behind a window, a piece of the scenery they barely notice. The silence inside my house is relentless. It doesn't matter if the television is blaring or the radio hums in the background, the silence is still there. Beneath it all, It's not the kind of silence you can break with noise. It's the silence of not having anyone to speak to, not having anyone who truly hears you. In my younger days, I never thought much about conversation. Words flowed easily then. At the dinner table, at work, at the pub, there was always someone to talk to, always someone to listen. Now, entire days pass without me saying more than a polite thank you to the cashier at the shop, or good morning to a passing neighbor. Sometimes, when my own voice startles me, I realize just how rare it has become to use it. Loneliness has a way of distorting time. Hours stretch endlessly, especially in the afternoons. The mornings, at least, have routine: tea, the newspaper, a short walk to keep my legs moving. But by midday, the house feels oppressive. I'll wander from room to room, straightening picture frames, dusting shelves that don't really need, dusting in the spare bedroom where my grandchildren once slept on visits. The bed remains neatly made, untouched for years. Sometimes I sit on the edge of it, as though expecting one of them to come bounding in with laughter and noise. But the room stays quiet, always quiet. The evenings are the hardest. As the light fades, so too does my resolve. I cook something, simple eggs on toast, or perhaps a tin of soup, and eat at the kitchen table alone. The clink of the spoon against the bowl echoes too loudly in the empty room. After dinner, I turn on the television, not because I care about the programs, but because the voices keep me company. Newsreaders, game show hosts, even the canned laughter from sitcoms, they all help mask the truth that I have no one to share the evening with. What makes loneliness in old age so cruel is not just the absence of others, but the abundance of memories. My mind is full of people who are no longer here, Margaret. My parents, old friends, who have either passed away or drifted out of touch. The faces come to me in dreams, vivid and warm, and for a moment I feel surrounded again. But then I wake, and the silence greets me once more. Sometimes I wonder if I did this to myself. Did I push people away without realizing it? Did I fail to nurture the connections that might have sustained me in these later years? It's a dangerous spiral, this kind of thinking, because it feeds the loneliness with guilt. And yet, it's hard not to question. When the phone doesn't ring for months, when no letters arrive, when even the holidays pass without a knock at the door, it's impossible not to wonder what went wrong. And then there are the small humiliations that come with being old and alone, struggling to open a jar and realizing there's no one around to help, forgetting to buy milk and having no one to ask to run to the shop, falling ill and lying in bed for days, hoping it doesn't get worse because there's no one to notice if it does. These are the quiet indignities of old age, the ones no one talks about, but they pile up until they feel like a mountain. Still, I try to keep going. I walk to Roundhay Park when the weather allows. I feed the ducks at the lake, though I know it's frowned upon. I sit on a bench and watch families go by, parents with prams, grandparents laughing with their grandchildren. Those moments are bittersweet. They remind me of what I once had and of what I have lost. I try not to linger too long. It's hard watching other people live the life you missed most. There are days when I almost convince myself that I'm content. I tell myself I enjoy the peace, that I like having my own routines, my own space. But deep down, I know that's just a story I tell myself to soften the truth. The truth is that loneliness is a disease of the soul, and it eats away at you slowly, year after year. It doesn't kill you outright, but it makes life feel smaller, grayer, less worth living. And yet, for all the weight of it, I still hold on to hope. Hope that the phone will ring, that one of my children will remember me, that a letter will arrive. Hope that maybe, just maybe, someone will knock on the door, and the silence will finally break. Because as painful as loneliness is, hope is the one thing it hasn't taken from me. Not yet. So I carry on. I wake, I drink my tea, I sit by the window. The silence is still there, always there. But so too is the hope that one day, a familiar voice will cut through it. Until then, I endure. Because that's what loneliness in old age teaches you most of all. How to endure. It was an ordinary Tuesday afternoon in Leeds when the extraordinary happened. I remember it vividly, because on most days, nothing ever happens, just the same routine, the same silence. I had settled into my armchair by the window, with a half-finished crossword puzzle resting on my lap. The television was on in the background, playing one of those afternoon quiz shows where the contestants always seem much cleverer than I ever was. The kettle had just boiled, and the comforting smell of strong tea filled the room. Then the phone rang. The sound startled me so much I nearly dropped my pencil. The phone in my house doesn't ring often, sometimes weeks go by without a single call. For a moment, I froze, staring at it as though it were a foreign object. Who could possibly be calling me in the middle of the day? My heart began to race, and I felt that strange mixture of hope and dread that only the lonely can understand. When I finally picked up the receiver, my voice came out hoarse. "Hello." There was a pause on the other end, just long enough for me to think it might be a wrong number. But then a man's voice spoke clear, professional, yet oddly warm. "Good afternoon. Is this Mr. Arthur Bennett?" I hesitated. It had been so long since anyone outside the doctor's office or the electricity company had addressed me formally by name. "Yes," I replied cautiously. "My name is James Carter," the man continued. "I'm a journalist with the BBC in London. I hope I'm not disturbing you." A journalist from London. My first instinct was disbelief. Surely this was some kind of scam. Why would anyone from the BBC want to speak with me, an old man sitting alone in Leeds? I almost hung up, but something in his tone, respectful, genuine, kept me on the line. "Well, you have the right person," I said slowly. "But I'm not sure why a journalist would be calling me." James chuckled lightly, though not unkindly. "I understand this must be unexpected. I came across your name in connection with some old community records from Manchester. I'm working on a piece about forgotten voices, stories of ordinary people who feel they've been overlooked or left behind. I was hoping you might be willing to talk to me about your experiences." For a moment, I couldn't speak. The words hung in the air. Forgotten voices. Was that really how I looked from the outside? Forgotten, overlooked. I felt my throat tighten. You want to hear my story?" I asked quietly, almost afraid of the answer. "Yes, Mr. Bennett," James said gently. "I'd like to hear about your life, whatever you're comfortable sharing. If you're open to it, I could even come up to Leeds and meet you in person." I sank back into the armchair, the receiver trembling slightly in my hand. It had been years, decades, even since anyone had shown such interest in me. My children rarely asked about my life, and here was a stranger, a journalist no less, who not only knew my name but wanted to hear what I had to say. I tried to sound calm, though my chest felt as though it might burst. "Well, I don't know if I have much to tell. My life has been rather ordinary. Sometimes it's the ordinary lives that reveal the most extraordinary truths," James replied. "If you'd be willing, I'd very much like to visit." I promised to think about it and gave him my address. After we ended the call, I just sat there, staring at the receiver in disbelief. The silence that had been my companion for so long was suddenly filled with something else: anticipation, hope, even fear, perhaps, but a kind of fear that felt alive, not dead. The rest of that day passed in a blur. I kept replaying the conversation in my mind. A journalist from London wanted to hear from me. Me, Arthur Bennett, the man even his own family seemed to have forgotten. What could I possibly say that would be worth broadcasting? And yet, James Carter had sounded sincere. He wasn't calling out of pity. He had sought me out deliberately, by name. That night, sleep eluded me. I kept imagining what it might be like to sit across from him, to tell him about my life in Manchester, about Margaret, about the silence that had swallowed my later years. Part of me feared that speaking the words aloud would make the loneliness feel even more real, but another part longed for the chance to be heard, to be seen. The next morning, I rang James back. My hands trembled as I dialed, afraid he might have changed his mind overnight, that perhaps he'd realized I wasn't worth the trouble. But when he answered, his voice carried the same steady warmth. "Mr. Bennett," he said, "I'm so glad you called." We arranged for him to visit the following week. In the days leading up to his arrival, I found myself doing things I hadn't done in years. I tidied the living room, polished the old oak table, even dusted the framed photographs of Margaret and the children that had sat neglected on the mantelpiece. I went shopping for biscuits and tea, determined not to appear unprepared. It was as if I were expecting a guest of honor, and in many ways, I was, because, for the first time in a long, long time, someone was coming to see me not out of duty, not out of obligation, but because he wanted to hear my voice. When the day finally came, and I heard the knock at the door, I felt a nervous flutter in my chest that I hadn't felt since my youth. As I opened the door to greet James Carter, the journalist from London, I realized something profound. The silence that had haunted me for so many years was about to be broken. When James Carter stepped into my home that morning, it was as if a draft of fresh air had entered with him. He wasn't dressed like I'd imagined a journalist from London would be. No sharp suit, no intimidating air of importance. Instead, he wore a simple navy jumper, dark jeans, and carried a small leather satchel slung across his shoulder. His smile was immediate and genuine, the kind that puts a man at ease before a word is spoken. "Mr. Bennett," he said warmly, extending his hand, "it's truly an honor to meet you." I shook his hand, surprised by how firm and steady his grip was. "Arthur, please," I replied, a little awkwardly. "Mr. Bennett makes me feel like a schoolteacher is about to scold me." He laughed, and the sound filled the room like sunlight cutting through clouds. For a moment, I almost forgot how long the house had been filled with nothing but silence. I led him to the living room where I'd set out a tray of biscuits and a pot of tea. Margaret would have been proud. She always said that offering tea was the first duty of any proper host. As I poured, James set up a small recorder on the coffee table, explaining that it was just so he wouldn't miss any details later. "Don't worry about formality," he reassured me. "Just speak as though we're two friends having a conversation." Two friends. The words struck me harder than I expected. I hadn't thought of myself as having a friend in years. At first, I stumbled, my voice cracked from disuse, and I wasn't sure where to begin. I told him a little about Leeds, about how quiet life had become, but he didn't push or rush me. He listened, truly listened, in a way that few people ever had. His eyes stayed fixed on me, not on his phone or on notes, but on me, as though what I had to say actually mattered. Gradually, the words began to flow. I spoke about my childhood in Manchester, about the narrow streets and the sense of community that no longer seemed to exist. I told him about Margaret, how we'd met at a dance hall in Salford, how she laughed at my clumsy two-step but still agreed to see me again. My voice softened when I described our wedding, the birth of our children, the Sunday dinners that had once filled our home with life. James leaned forward, not interrupting, occasionally nodding or asking a gentle question. "What did those Sundays mean to you?" he asked at one point. "Everything," I said without hesitation. They were proof that I mattered, that I was part of something larger than myself. Around that table, I wasn't just a man earning a wage. I was a husband, a father, a piece of a family. Then, without realizing it, I found myself speaking of the silence, the loneliness, the birthdays forgotten, the holidays spent alone, the phone that never rang. I confessed things I hadn't dared say aloud, not even to myself. That sometimes I sat in the spare room and imagined my grandchildren playing there. That sometimes, when I passed families in Roundhay Park, I had to turn away because the sight of their laughter cut too deeply. At one point, my voice broke, and I felt my eyes sting with tears. I tried to brush it off, embarrassed, but James didn't look away. He didn't shift uncomfortably or pretend not to notice. He simply sat there, present, allowing me the dignity of being human enough to feel. "That must be incredibly painful," he said softly. "It is," I admitted. "Loneliness is heavier than any burden I ever carried in my working years. And yet, somehow, it's invisible. No one sees it. No one wants to." For a long while, the only sound in the room was the ticking of the mantel clock. I had laid my heart bare to a stranger, and instead of judgment or pity, he offered something far rarer: understanding. We spoke for hours that day. I lost track of time entirely. I told him about the war stories my father used to recount, about working in the mills when I was younger, about the pride and the struggles of raising a family. We laughed when I recalled the time Peter, my eldest, tried to fix a broken radio and ended up shocking himself so badly he refused to touch electronics for months. We smiled at the memory of Sophie, my youngest, staging elaborate puppet shows in the living room with socks and cardboard cutouts. As the afternoon light shifted, James finally closed his notebook and turned off the recorder. "Arthur," he said, his voice thick with sincerity, "what you've shared today is powerful. These are not just your memories, they are pieces of a much bigger story. A story about family, about aging, about what it means to be seen. I promise I'll do justice to your words." I didn't know what to say. All I could manage was, "Thank you for listening." When he left, the house felt strangely alive, as though some of the silence had been driven out by the echo of our conversation. I sat down in the armchair and stared at the photographs on the mantel. For the first time in years, they didn't feel like relics of a past life. They felt connected to the present, as though speaking them aloud had tethered me back to my own story. That night, I didn't need the television to drown out the silence. My own voice, the one I had almost forgotten I had, lingered in the air. I replayed the conversation in my head, astonished by how much lighter I felt, not because my circumstances had changed, but because someone had borne witness to them. The days that followed were different. The loneliness didn't vanish, of course, but it was softened by the knowledge that my words were now out there, carried by someone who cared enough to amplify them. For years, I had been invisible, but in the span of a single afternoon, with a pot of tea and a tape recorder, I felt seen again. Looking back now, I realized that the interview didn't just change the way others might see me, it changed the way I saw myself. I wasn't just the forgotten old man in Leeds anymore. I was Arthur Bennett, a man with a story worth telling. And that made all the difference. I never thought I'd live to see the day when my name would be spoken on national television. Not because I considered myself unworthy, but because people like me, the quiet, ordinary folk, don't usually end up in headlines or broadcasts. We live our lives in small houses, on modest streets, raising families, working our jobs, and then, more often than not, we fade quietly into the background. That's how it had been for me, at least, until James Carter came into my living room, with his satchel and his tape recorder. It was about 3 weeks after our interview that he called me again. I remember the moment clearly. I was halfway through a bowl of porridge in the morning when the phone rang. For once, I recognized the voice on the other end immediately. "Arthur," James said, his tone bright, "I wanted you to be the first to know your story will air this Friday evening on BBC News." My heart stuttered at the words. My story. On the BBC, he explained the segment would be part of a broader feature on loneliness among the elderly in Britain. "But yours," he added, "yours will be the voice that carries it. It's your story, Arthur, that ties it all together." After we ended the call, I just sat there staring into my porridge until it had gone cold. I didn't know what to feel. Pride, fear, perhaps both, tangled together in a knot inside my chest. The days leading up to that Friday seemed to stretch endlessly. I went about my routines, but everything felt charged with anticipation. Each morning, I awoke with the thought, in just a few days, people across the country will hear my voice. They will know my name. They will know I exist. Friday finally arrived. I spent the day restless, tidying the house even though no one was coming over, ironing a shirt I didn't plan to wear, pacing between rooms as though I had somewhere important to be. By the time evening came, I was seated in my armchair, the remote clutched tightly in my hand, the television tuned to BBC One. The program began like any other news segment: headlines, politics, stories from abroad. My heart raced with every transition, wondering when, or if, my moment would come. And then I heard it. And now, we turn to a special report on loneliness in later life, featuring the story of one man from Leeds, Arthur Bennett. Hearing my own name spoken so clearly, so publicly, was like a jolt to the heart. For a second, I thought I might cry right then and there. The screen showed a clip of my house, filmed from outside. Then, there I was, sitting in my own living room, my hands folded nervously on my lap, speaking into James's recorder. My voice filled the airwaves. "I sometimes feel like I've been erased," I heard myself say, "like the world has moved on and forgotten I was ever here." The sound of my voice startled me. It was deeper than I remembered, rougher around the edges, but undeniably mine. I sat there, transfixed, as my own story unfolded on the screen. They showed photos of Margaret and the children, clips of me walking through Roundhay Park, sitting on the bench by the lake, staring out at the water. Overlaid were my words about Sunday dinners in Manchester, about the silence in Leeds, about the longing to be remembered. For years, I had lived with these thoughts bottled up inside me, with no one to hear them. And now, suddenly, they were being broadcast to millions of homes across Britain. It was as though the silence that had defined my life for so long was being shattered in one sweeping moment. By the time the segment ended, my cheeks were wet. I hadn't even realized I was crying. I sat there for a long while after the program finished, the house unusually still, my breathing unsteady. Then, it happened. The phone rang, and it didn't stop ringing. The first call was from my daughter Elaine in Birmingham. "Dad, I just saw you on the BBC," she said, her voice a mixture of shock and guilt. "I had no idea you felt that way." I didn't know how to respond. Part of me wanted to shout, "Of course you didn't. You never called." But another part of me, the larger part, just felt relief. Relief that she had heard me, finally heard me, even if it had taken a television screen to make it happen. Then Peter rang. From Liverpool. His voice was quieter, more hesitant. "Dad, I'm sorry," he said simply. Those two words carried years of absence in them. Over the next hour, the calls kept coming. Nieces, nephews, even an old friend from Manchester I hadn't spoken to in decades. People I thought had long forgotten me, suddenly remembered, suddenly cared. My story, my voice, had pulled me out of the shadows and into their awareness again. But it wasn't just family. The next morning, I received a letter, an actual handwritten letter from a woman in Scotland who said she had watched the program and felt less alone because of it. "Your words," she wrote, "were my words too. Thank you for speaking them out loud." I sat at my kitchen table with that letter in my hand, and I realized something profound. It wasn't just about me anymore. By telling my story, I had given voice to countless others who lived with the same silence. I wasn't just Arthur Bennett. The forgotten old man from Ledseye was Arthur Bennett, a man whose story resonated. For the first time in years, I felt like I mattered. That evening, as I poured myself a cup of tea, I caught my reflection in the kitchen window. I looked tired, older than I felt inside, but my eyes carried a spark I hadn't seen in a long time. A spark that whispered, "You are not invisible, not anymore." The phone calls after the broadcast didn't stop for days. At first I thought it would just be that one evening, my children, a few friends, perhaps a distant relative or two. But as the weekend unfolded, my quiet little home in Leeds, which had known years of silence, suddenly became the center of a storm. On Saturday morning, the postman came struggling up the path with a stack of envelopes so thick it barely fit through the slot. I had not received that much post in years. Most of it was from strangers, letters of kindness, of solidarity, of people who said they saw themselves in my story. But tucked between those envelopes were cards from my own family. Elaine's handwriting was there, Peter's too. For years, they had barely remembered my birthday, and now they were writing to me. But the real test came with the visits. On Sunday afternoon, there was a knock at the door. When I opened it, I nearly fell back from the shock. Standing there was Elaine, my eldest daughter, holding a tin of biscuits in one hand and her handbag in the other. Behind her was her husband, Richard, and two of my children who had grown into young adults while I remained frozen in time, waiting. "Dad," Elaine said softly, her eyes wide, as though she couldn't quite believe she was standing on my doorstep. For a moment, I didn't know whether to embrace her or shut the door. My mind filled with memories of the years I had called and left unanswered messages, of birthdays spent alone, of Christmases where her chair at my table remained empty. I wanted to shout, to demand where she had been all these years, but the sight of her standing there, with those familiar Bennett eyes, and that same nervous smile she had as a child, softened me. So I stepped aside and said simply, "Come in." The house, usually so still, was suddenly alive with voices. My grandchildren commented on the photographs on the mantelpiece, surprised to see their own childhood pictures framed and dusted. Richard tried to make small talk about football. Elaine, however, sat close to me, her hands trembling slightly as she poured the tea. "Dad," she said, finally looking me in the eye, I didn't realize how much we'd left you behind." Her voice cracked, and she quickly reached for a tissue. "Watching you on the news, it broke something inside me. I thought I had more time, that you were fine, that you didn't need us as much anymore. But I was wrong." I listened, my hands folded tightly in my lap. I had imagined this moment so many times, my children acknowledging the years of silence. I had imagined feeling triumphant, vindicated. Instead, all I felt was an aching mix of sorrow and relief. Yes, she was here. Yes, she cared now. But where had she been when the loneliness was crushing me? I didn't say any of that out loud. Instead, I replied quietly, "It would have meant the world to me, Elaine, if you'd called. Just once in a while." She nodded, tears spilling freely. I know, and I'm so sorry." Later that evening, after they left, I sat alone again in the silence. But it was a different kind of silence, one filled with possibility rather than despair. Then, on Tuesday, Peter arrived. My son had always been the more distant of the two. Even when he was young, he was quiet, thoughtful, always hiding his emotions behind books or music. When I opened the door to him, I was struck by how much older he looked, grey in his beard, lines etched deep around his eyes. For a moment, I saw myself in him. "Dad," he said simply, his voice low, "I owe you an apology." We sat together in the living room, no television on, no distractions, just father and son, finally confronting the years of absence. "I don't have an excuse," Peter admitted. I thought you were stronger than you are, that you didn't need me checking in. And if I'm honest, I was selfish. I built my life, my career, and I forgot you were here, living alone." His words were heavy, but they were true. And truth, even when painful, has a strange way of healing. I looked at him for a long time before replying. "You know, Peter, I never expected perfection. I just wanted to be remembered." He nodded, his eyes wet. "You'll never be forgotten again." But the most surprising call came from across the ocean. One evening, the phone rang, and when I answered, I heard a bright, unfamiliar voice. "Grandpa Arthur, this is Sophie, from New York. I'm your granddaughter." Sophie was Peter's eldest, the one who had moved to the United States years ago with her mother. I hadn't spoken to her in over a decade. Now, here she was, thousands of miles away, telling me she had watched the segment online. I didn't. "No," she said, her voice breaking. "I didn't know you were so alone. I want to come visit you. I want to know you before it's too late." I sat there, the receiver pressed against my ear, stunned into silence. The idea that my story had traveled so far, reaching across oceans to awaken a granddaughter I thought lost to MIT, was overwhelming. As the weeks went by, more calls, more letters, more visits followed. My once forgotten name had become a thread, stitching my family back together. And yet, I would be lying if I said it was simple. Every visit carried shadows of the past. Every apology reopened wounds. There were times I wanted to shout, to demand why it took a television broadcast to bring them back. But there were also moments of laughter, of warmth, of shared memories returning like long-lost treasures. The truth is, I felt torn. Part of me was angry. Another part of me was grateful. And somewhere in the middle, I was afraid that this sudden rush of attention would fade, and I would be left in silence once again. But for now, I chose to accept what was given. For now, I allowed myself to hope. For the first time in years, my house in Leeds no longer felt like a forgotten corner of the world. It felt alive again, with voices, with laughter, with family. And though the wounds of the past would never fully disappear, I began to see the possibility of healing. When I look back now, I almost laugh at the irony of it all. For years, I felt invisible, an old man in Leeds, whose footsteps echoed only within the narrow walls of his house. I had convinced myself that my life story had ended long ago, that I was merely living in the footnotes of everyone else's chapters. Yet all it took to change that was a journalist, a microphone, and the sound of my name spoken aloud on live television. It wasn't fame I wanted. It wasn't even attention. What I craved, deep in my bones, was acknowledgement. To be seen, to be remembered, to matter. And when that happened, when millions of people heard my name, when letters and calls poured in, when my own children found their way back to my doorstep, I realized something vital. I had never truly lost my voice. I had simply stopped believing it was worth using. For years, I let silence define me. I swallowed words I wanted to say, grief, longing because I assumed no one was listening. That silence became a prison, and I was its most obedient prisoner. But that day on the news, when I spoke my truth, even in fragments, I unlocked something inside myself. Finding my voice again has not been easy. At first it felt strange, even frightening, to speak honestly about my pain. To tell Elaine that her absence had cut me deeper than she realized. To tell Peter that birthdays missed and calls unanswered had left scars. To tell Sophie in New York that I wanted to know her before time slipped away from me completely. Each word was heavy, each confession difficult. But each time I spoke, the weight on my chest grew lighter. I discovered that my voice was more powerful than I ever imagined, not because it reached thousands through a television broadcast, but because it reached the people who mattered most, my family. There's something remarkable about hearing your own truth spoken aloud. It reshapes the way you see yourself. For so long, I had thought of myself as a burden, an afterthought. But when I spoke, when I told my story, I began to see myself differently. I was not a man to be pitied. I was not just the lonely grandfather sitting by the window. I was Arthur Benater, father, a storyteller, a man with memories that deserved to be carried forward. It's strange how much has changed since that night. My house is still the same worn armchair, the same photographs on the mantelpiece, the same garden where weeds outnumber flowers, and yet it feels transformed, because I no longer sit in silence. My phone rings, letters arrive, footsteps echo on the stairs when Elaine or Peter visit. Laughter fills the rooms when my grandchildren come by. Even Sophie, true to her word, flew from New York that summer, her arms open wide as she met me at the train station. But beyond the visits and calls, the greatest change has been within me. I no longer wait quietly for life to happen. I no longer believe that old age is synonymous with invisibility. I speak sometimes too much. My children tease, but I speak, because I refuse to go back into silence. I've started keeping a journal, filling page after page with my thoughts. Some days, I write about my memories growing up in Leeds during the war, meeting Margaret for the first time in a small cafe on Brigade, raising my children with dreams bigger than my paycheck. Other days, I write about my loneliness, because putting it into words takes away its sting. And sometimes, I write about hope that my story might help others who feel forgotten. The journalist who first aired my story, a young man named Daniel, came to see me again months later. He asked if I regretted sharing so much of myself on television. I thought about it carefully before answering. No, I said, because telling the truth gave me my family back, and more than that, it gave me myself back. He nodded, smiling in that quiet way reporters do when they know they've stumbled upon something meaningful. If there's one lesson I've learned, it's this: silence protects no one. We tell ourselves that keeping quiet spares us from rejection, from conflict, from pain. But in reality, silence only deepens those wounds. When we speak, when we dare to say, I am here, I matter, I hurt, I love, we open the door to healing. I cannot reclaim the lost years. I cannot erase the Christmas dinners eaten alone, or the birthdays without a single phone call, or the countless nights when I wondered if my name was even remembered by my own children. Those years will always be part of me. But now, instead of bitterness, I choose to carry them as proof of survival. Proof that even when ignored, I endured. And more importantly, I choose to carry forward the new years, the ones where my home is filled again, where my family sits around the table, where my voice is heard, not because a camera is pointed at me, but because the people I love are finally listening. Sometimes, in the evenings, I sit in my rocking chair by the window, looking out at the quiet street of Leeds. The world moves quickly, children racing on bicycles, buses rattling past, neighbors coming and going. I know my time in this world is shorter now than it once was, but I no longer fear that I will leave it unseen. I found my voice again, and with it, I found myself. So if you are listening, if you are someone who feels invisible, forgotten, left behind, let me tell you this: speak. Even if your voice shakes, even if your words come slowly, even if no one seems to care at first, speak, because your story matters. Speak, because you matter. I am Arthur Bennett, a man who once thought he was invisible. And now, I am living proof that even in the quietest corners of life, a voice, just one voice, can change everything.